Hey everyone, and thank you for joining Make It Work, the MITRE ATT&CK framework and how to put it into practice. My name is Lisa Malcava, and I'm the communications director here at Capsulate. I'm joined by Brandon Embert, our co-founder and chief scientist, and guest speaker, Josh Zelonis, principal analyst at Forrester, and they're going to break down the practical aspects of detection with the ATT&CK framework and the most useful tactics and techniques that will actually make your company safer. Before I turn it over to them, a couple of quick housekeeping items. If you have any questions, please do type them into the Q&A box provided, and we will try to get to them all at the conclusion of the webcast. Also, this webcast will be available on demand, and we'll send a link over once it's ready to go. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Brandon to kick us off.
Thank you very much, Lisa, and thank you for joining us today, Josh.
Thank you for having me.
So I think we should jump right in. And you know, I don't want to go too much into the 101 of what is the ATT&CK framework. I think it is important to cover a little bit about its background, though I've probably a good number of the people dialing in this call know what the framework is. So you know, in short, it's a knowledge base of tactics, techniques, and things that have been seen in the wild that can be used to observe if an attack is happening. But it's boomed in popularity recently. I feel like people are using this now to actually have a starting point for looking at how they should be evaluating their visibility into networks and detections. What are your thoughts on that and the sort of value it brings to people and why it's picked up so much?
You know, it's interesting because whenever I look at what the ATT&CK framework offers us, I think of it as a corpus. It's a language for describing threat that we can use across our security organizations and even beyond security, but to even be speaking to board members and explaining what's happening. And the value is that, you know, it helps everyone from the threat intelligence teams to the blue teams to the red teams. It gives us all the same language and the same perspective so that we can actually start communicating about threat.
I think it's important that we have that starting point too, that we can begin and have that common language, common terms on which we're speaking when we're looking at threats. How do you think people should measure their ability to be successful in applying like having visibility into these various techniques? You know, there's a vast array of different things that can be observed. How should people be thinking about how they measure up to the rest of the field, or what is a normal amount of visibility or detection, or whether or not they're actually, you know, how should they measure value from what they're able to see with it?
I think that the most important thing is to understand how to leverage it, just to begin. Let's not start measuring how we compare with our peers yet, but let's just start this with a bit of a conversation about how to begin to apply it. And what are the individual pieces? And to dig into this, you know, what I like to describe is, you know, techniques as being the how something's done. Now, what's interesting about the ATT&CK framework is that, you know, there's well over 100 different techniques in there, and the vast majority of them are not in and of themselves malicious or bad. And so, you know, understanding and being able to map what is going on in your network can help you understand how something's happening, and then put that together in order to understand the why or the tactics as we have listed here.
I think, well, that's a good answer. How would you consider this different than the cyber kill chain in that regard?
I generally draw a comparison to the tactics as being the storyline of what happens in a breach scenario. So I feel that, you know, a lot of the information is actually encapsulated in the ATT&CK framework, but then with more granularity as you look at the techniques and see how you put different techniques together in order to build these tactics and to operate as you move through the kill chain.
Gotcha. That's interesting. So who should be using this? What like and where should they begin?
It depends on your role, and that's really the beauty of this attack framework, is that if you're a red teamer and you want to take a look at how would I go and do this? You can use the attack framework almost as a roadmap to understand what you need to be doing or what you can be doing next. And from an intelligence perspective, you're going and building out the tactics, techniques, and procedures of a particular adversary. It may be an actor, it may be a campaign, but if you're mapping that to the tactics and techniques in the attack framework, then you're able to, I guess, start to inform everything from how you would do simulations emulating an actor to what specific techniques that you should be prioritizing within your organization, because you know that adversaries that are targeting your vertical leverage these specific techniques.
That's interesting. Is that as part of the attack framework, where should prioritization begin there, or is it based on the where the verticals against which we've seen these techniques used? So you select those if they align with your vertical. Is it just that? And do you think that there's an element of precedence that should happen with the techniques if you don't have a vertical with which you align that you've seen them used?
Well, you used the word visibility earlier, and I'm going to say that anybody, regardless of the maturity of your threat intelligence capability, should be monitoring and trying to map alerts and events that they're detecting within their security operations center to the tactics and techniques of the attack framework. And over time, what you're going to do is you're going to build a map of that framework that gives you some idea about the visibility into those tactics and techniques that you have with your current mitigation strategy. And this gives you situational awareness, which is probably the most important place to start.
Right. So it's not any one technique should take precedence over the other, but whether or not you could have visibility into all of them is a good starting point of saying, like, what level of awareness do I even have?
I don't think that anybody's goal should be to have exhaustive coverage of the attack framework. And even if you were to go and check off all the different techniques in the attack framework, there's an entire next level of depth that each of these techniques has. We've had a conversation in the past about process injection as an example of a particular technique of which there's many different ways to implement it.
Right.
So just because you've demonstrated the ability to detect a method of performing this doesn't by any means mean that you have it covered.
Right. And so I wonder if that means that there should be a distinction between the techniques, between whether I'm able to recognize a possible cause or the resulting phenomena of I know process injection happened versus I observed one of the techniques which could be used to achieve it. And I don't know if that's maybe some direction we might want to start thinking about with the attack framework as moving forward.
I think so. Well, one of the big things that you need to research as you're diving into this and starting to figure out what your visibility actually is researching the techniques in order to understand how they happen in the wild. And having that third dimension into the attack framework, it would be helpful to start including that in the attack framework so that people would have a better reference architecture instead of having to go and do the research themselves.
Right, collect all that, assemble that themselves. That makes sense. All right. So we'll posit here that it's not a one size fits all, and I think part of that is because people do have different stances for visibility. They have different requirements for needing to observe different techniques, and also not every environment would be covered by the techniques that are there. Not all the techniques won't apply to every environment, rather. what ways do you think this applies, or like where do you see as shortcomings in the framework?
One of the biggest shortcomings I see, and we discussed the problem of depth and not understanding the different methods that a technique is realized, but I really feel that there's a lack of understanding in the market about what it is and is not. And to an extent, I've seen organizations trying to map to the attack framework in a manner that's very similar to playing bingo, where, hey, I managed to detect this particular technique, so let's mark that one off. And if we get them all in a row, then we win.
Right.
And well, actually, if you detect an adversary getting them all in a row, you lost. But that's a different story.
Right. So instead of playing bingo, it should be more of if any of the letters fire, not if it spells bingo, or and how many different ways can you see if a given letter and arrangement can come into existence?
Absolutely. And there's other problems as well. I've heard a criticism that it tends to be very breach centric or breach focused.
Yeah.
And you mentioned the kill chain, and when you take a look at what the objectives of a particular adversary is, it may not be to get in and steal data. It may be to cause destruction or harm.
Right.
Ransomware being a great example of this.
Right. And so where that won't necessarily follow the techniques as they're laid out because it's a different objective entirely.
Yes. In fact, they may stop partway through the tactics, through the kill chain, because they're done. Yeah.
Huh. So how about I want to skip over the point of being overwhelming for the time being, because I'm curious to talk about other environments. I feel like Linux. You said it's breach centric, which is why I want to talk about this other point. I think Linux by surprise ate the enterprise or a lot of the enterprise infrastructure over the last 8 to 10 years, and as a result, we have less visibility into it, and consequently, we have fewer participants that are able to submit breach info for Linux that would be applied for new techniques in the framework, and I think there's opportunity for that to grow there. What are your thoughts on that?
It's interesting because the crowdsourced nature of attack is that people are contributing where they have expertise, and it's interesting now to see all the different other ways that the attack framework's being leveraged or additional. There's the enterprise attack, and now there's pre-attack, and there's so many different ways that this is growing, and it's the very nature of it being, I'll say, decentralized, and perhaps I'm not doing a service to MITRE in doing so, but that I guess the fact that it's crowdsourced, you're naturally going to get people contributing where they're most interested, and it does seem like Linux may be falling behind a bit.
Right. Yeah. And I'm curious. I think I hope that doesn't become a circular problem where if the lack of visibility means there aren't techniques, means people aren't looking, means they're confirming that they don't have anything to see, and we get this sort of bias coming out of not seeing stuff in Linux. So it would. I don't know. For me, I think it'd be good to see more of those emerge, because I think it's got rich stuff on the Windows side, like the process injection stuff on Windows is great. Or maybe nobody's hacking Linux boxes. That's why.
Or Android phones.
Or Android phones, or any of those. So around how it can be complex or people find it overwhelming, there are new techniques coming out all the time. A lot of these, like I know that they just unleashed a bunch towards cloud. In those environments, where do we see that going, and what should they be doing there to keep up? How should they be situationally aware there?
You need to understand, go back to the definition of the attack framework as a corpus, and it's interesting because every year they add new words to the dictionary, and they add new techniques to the attack framework, and so you can't treat it as an exhaustive list of things that are out there. But, as security researchers continue to work on these problems and detect things that are occurring in the wild. Hopefully they're going to continue contributing back into the attack framework to help us build this corpus.
One other question actually before telemetry on that point. Do you know about there being any concerns people have in exposing, if it is breach centric, are there ways to further enable people sharing that data, or has that been a concern where if they don't want to discuss a breach, but they do want to share these upstream to help other people get them into the attack framework? Are there any thoughts on that?
I haven't really come across any situations where people were hesitant to provide information about emerging techniques or tactics that they were seeing. I think that a lot of the contribution would come from IR providers. And even when it comes to information sharing between organizations, using ISACs and ISALs in order to go and share information is really seen as beneficial, because the most valuable type of threat intelligence that you will ever obtain comes from within your organization. It's internal intelligence. It's things that you detected that you know are absolutely relevant to your organization, because that's where it happened. But the next closest thing, and perhaps more preferable, is to get that intelligence from somebody who looks just like you.
Yeah. What's it? Something only have to outrun the other person, not outrun the bear, or something.
Exactly.
So telemetry, we talk about the attack framework as these techniques, which are usually some of telemetry or intelligence can be derived from telemetry. Let's talk about what is telemetry.
The simplest definition of telemetry that I could give you is that it is a collection of security relevant events and data around those events that are occurring on a system or a network device at any given point in time.
And so it's not necessarily synonymous with detection, because it may not necessarily mean something was malicious, or?
Well, it's required for detection. If you can't see something, then you can't associate it with malicious behavior. So telemetry is really the most fundamental building block that you can have for detection. And what's interesting is that as you start collecting telemetry, individual events themselves, so let's use a file access as an example. So when you open a file, that can be associated with the process, with the parent process. It can be associated with the system that it happened on, the name of the file, perhaps more importantly, the hash of the file. Then you go and you can start digging into things like, what was the user who did this? And perhaps what application opened it. So there's a ton of information that can be obtained around this one particular event. And all of that is the, quote, telemetry around that particular event. Now, if you go and you check that hash against a list of known hashes for malware, for instance, and it matches, now you have a detection because you had an event that you were able to correlate to known malware. And so then perhaps perhaps the example shouldn't have been file open, but file execute, and then we would have process execution in the attack framework. Now, that's a one-to-one relationship that you have there. But there's certainly scenarios where it takes multiple pieces of telemetry in order to develop what turns into a technique. And so when that happens, then you can no longer say that I'm doing detection based on this one piece of telemetry. What you're doing is you're building the next level of building blocks in painting a picture or building a sculpture of something that you may at some point recognize as being malicious.
So that's interesting. The context is always important. And that also makes me want to ask that, given some of the techniques inside of the framework, and I may be even jumping ahead a slide here, I'm not sure. Some of the techniques provided, will be things like, running IP tables or other just common tools that are used for either networking or system information that on their own may not actually constitute an attack. So it may take multiple pieces of telemetry to even identify a technique. And would it be fair to say then perhaps even multiple techniques before you before you would even want to say, well, that constitutes an attack? Like, or is there value in, obviously there's value in having telemetry in context. Is the same true of those techniques?
Absolutely. And, everything is an abstraction. You have instructions on a processor. And then you get a sequence of instructions that may constitute a syscall. And then, that may be pulling your telemetry out of that. And one of the early ways that I used to describe the telemetry collection of, say, the EDR space was piping S-trace into the cloud. So is you're doing abstraction upon abstraction and building toward identifying something as being a particular tactic that this adversary appears to be attempting to accomplish privilege escalation, as an example. So what's interesting is I went through the MITRE ATT&CK evaluation that simulated APT3. And in going through and researching the particular techniques that were used there, I found that there was only a few of those that I would absolutely want to know about if they happened in my environment. Now, one of them we can all agree on, Mimikatz reading from LSAS process. Probably want to know if that's going on in your environment.
Right.
But then at the same time, there was things like ARP-A, ipconfig/all, things that if I got an alert in the SOC, I'd probably throw my laptop through the wall.
Right.
So it's when you start putting things together, in most cases, that you get a better picture, and to the point you can be more confident in an indictment. It's one thing to get an alert generated by a product and you're told what the severity of it is. It's a whole other thing to know how confident you can be that that is actually a true positive for malicious activity.
Yeah, and it sounds like confidence is something that maybe becomes more valuable when we start thinking about these techniques. Like, confident that the technique happened. Okay, yes, our that's fine, but that's maybe not so severe, I guess. But confidence that something is representing an attack by the greater something in the sum of them than any one of their individual pieces, maybe. And maybe that's something to think about. When I have been looking at the attack framework, it's like, what are other fields we could be adding to this? Because and how should we be evaluating detection? Because I know one of the evaluation criteria that you had used for the ability to observe any given technique is there telemetry present, which is not necessarily detection itself. And then is there the ability to detect, but after the fact, being able to analyze the telemetry, and then is there the ability to actually detect as it happens by piecing all these things together sort of on the fly. It feels like there could be other dimensions to that as well. Like, is there a way that you could state confidence based on how many other techniques happen in succession? Or, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, absolutely. And it may not even be a quantifiable thing that, there was 4 and so we were only 80%, but now there's 5 and so this is definitely bad.
Right.
What you want to do is you want to take a look at, and this is where something like cyber intelligence becomes real valuable, in that you can understand the commodity attacks that are happening from, say, cyber criminals and what they look like in terms of the techniques in use. And then you can look at, other adversaries that are known to target your particular vertical and figure out what techniques they commonly use. And taking that information there, you can build specific detections to say, all right, well, this not only looks bad, but it looks like this. And, it's not a full attribution, and that shouldn't be your goal, as so much as to be able to say, look, we really do need to have an analyst take a look at this because this mirrors something that we know is associated with something that is bad. So your confidence level is being supported by intelligence.
And so that's something that the people applying the framework need to sort of sort and identify that's relevant to them.
Absolutely. And this takes us back to the early part of this conversation where we were talking about what to do when you're trying to map the individual techniques that you're able to get detection on. Because as you dig into this deeper and you start leveraging intelligence in order to understand what techniques are commonly used by actors who may very likely be targeting you, then you can go and start building and tailoring your mitigation strategy or your detection strategy to make sure that you're able to have visibility into those particular techniques.
Yep, absolutely. What about, and we've got a screenshot here, I think this is taken from MITRE's page. What about correlation? How valuable should correlation be between any given piece of telemetry, or any given technique to an attack? And how should people be thinking about where value is with that correlation?
Well, I really feel that this is a continuation of what we've been discussing. As you're going through and you're associating that these particular techniques have been occurring on the same system or in the same process tree or by the same user, that you then go and you can associate them and tie them together and say, well, I saw these 6 or 8 different whatever things happening in the environment, nothing I'd ever really want to know about, except for the fact that they're all happening and this is unique to the environment. So now we definitely need to spend some time looking at it. So what correlation gives you is twofold. One, it allows you to ramp up the confidence that you have that an incident is occurring within your environment, but it also has another wonderful side benefit of bringing together the pieces that a level 1 SOC analyst would need to be looking at in order to further investigate and make that indictment. What you're doing is you're showing people where they need to be looking.
By correlating, by bringing them together, it's saying this is the general direction of where things are, or this is where the fire is, because we can see smoke on either side, and we tie it together and say that there's definitely more to be investigated here or collected.
Absolutely.
Interesting. It's interesting to think about the techniques as sort of those stepping stones or starting locations for doing correlation on your own even. And I guess the more of them you see, the more you know that that's where your priority should reside. Well,
if a product isn't doing correlation, the level 1 SOC analyst has to do it.
It's doing it, right.
So in the end, correlation is something that's going to happen as long as you have the antecedent of detection.
Right. The more of it that you can have done for you up front, though, the faster your ability to respond or a SOC analyst's ability to triage.
You're going to have a quantifiable improvement in or return on investment just by the very nature of the salaries that you're
spending
that are not being paid for people to do work that's now being automated.
Right. I think one other point on this, you had put out the post around, I think it was called Tainted Love, which it discussed process trees and correlation, which I thought was an excellent post because it captures what any human is going to do if they can see the events happen in real time. And what I think products should be doing, which is to say, if we already know this one process is bad, obviously anything which immediately descends from it is bad. But of course, any process that it can influence or touch or inject code into, we should now taint as well as being bad. Which should be, I feel like that's as far as techniques goes, something that should raise the priority on them as well when you've seen them. It's like, how far removed are these from something else, or do they directly descend, for that matter, from something that we've already seen exhibit malicious behavior?
And as much as you're detecting a process has behaved in a, let's say, malicious fashion, so then everything that happens in that process, in fact, the entire process tree after that, has to be viewed as tainted.
Yes.
Now, that doesn't guarantee that it's bad, because you may have compromised a service that has multiple threads that get spun out of it, and then maybe a majority of those threads are behaving as they're supposed to.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that you haven't taken control of the process, and that you don't have the ability to fork off new processes, open network connections, do all kinds of things.
Right.
And so you need to be able to go and look not only downstream for what may have happened after that, but what you really want to do is you want to try to work your way back up the stack to go and figure out what was P0 here, what was
right,
what was the initialization event.
Yes. Yeah. Right, and not to just treat any subsequent event as something malicious, because just because it spun up threads, the act of spinning up threads themselves is not bad. It made a connections themselves are not bad, but can you use the information from what it did to then further establish or further investigate, and then if it is bad, apply that pivot, look across the rest of your environment. And
then we can even say what is really bad. What we really want to do is triage what happened, and let's say we saw a file access somewhere. Where could that file be getting exfiltrated to, and how could an adversary be leveraging system commands in order to go and exfiltrate that somewhere else? Right,
which gives you more to enhance your hunting, if you will, at that point.
Yes.
Okay, so I mean, I think we started on this a little bit at the beginning. But where should people start, just from, if they just are hearing about attack for the first time, or if they haven't had a chance to actually put it into practice yet, and they all of a sudden someone's like, well, what do you want to do? And they're like, well, I want to start with attack. Where should they begin in applying this? I mean, I know that you had said, like, obviously identifying where previously we had seen actors attacking a certain vertical. If that vertical aligns with yours, those may be meaningful, but even from just like step one, like how should people build, or
Step one, I've just heard of the attack framework and noticed that it has an ampersand instead of an A in the third or fourth character. Great. What do you do? I think that you should start by looking at the individual tactics and understanding the kill chain processes, and starting a conversation within your organization about mapping and understanding the significance of the stages of an attack.
Mm.
And then from that point, you can then go and start mapping individual techniques that you're observing within your environment to those tactics. And so then you can start to tell a story with the detections that are occurring about where in this sequence of events or kill chain that an adversary may be. Now, let me rephrase that a little bit and say that a detected incident that we're trying to triage, where in the kill chain that is. And so I would say that that's where you want to get to next. But understand that being able to go and associate and take telemetry, or let's just call it log data, and map events to techniques is going to give us the building blocks that we can start having these types of conversations, and then go and leverage things like threat intelligence and open up more and more conversations within our organization about what it means to see this.
It sounds like that's important for in the what it means to see this, to not also accidentally inundate yourself with alerts as well, just because you don't want to pick up any one technique and then just say, well, I'm seeing it everywhere, so we're clearly thoroughly owned, but to actually have a sense of meaning to it.
That could be a very expensive mistake.
Yes. All right. How about cloud infrastructure? I mean, I think 36 new techniques focused mostly on SaaS. What should people be doing there? Like, how does it apply? Or how is it different than traditional environments?
That is a tough question. I'd start by saying that it's not really.
Okay.
In the end, these are still systems, virtualized or not.
Just someone else's. It's someone else's telemetry. It's just
so. As you're executing code, you're going to be performing operations, and as these operations are occurring, you should be generating logs or telemetry in order to understand what's happening. Being able to pull things out of, say, application layers and perhaps cloud workloads or containers, that's a level of visibility that you don't get in a lot of areas, just by the nature of what these what these cloud processes are doing. So being able to go and take a look at something like an endpoint telemetry piece and start treating your cloud infrastructure the same way that you would treat your endpoint infrastructure is really critical to detecting all the different places where an adversary could be.
Do you think we've definitely seen the attack framework being used as sort of a metric. I mean, obviously for evaluations against EDR. Do you think that one, EDR or technologies that have been graded against the attack framework are going to start incorporating more cloud information, and then two, that the cloud providers are going to start exposing better endpoints or API and endpoints for people to collect the right data in order to start looking for these techniques?
I think we're very early in this process. I think that we'll get there, but I don't know how soon that's going to be.
Yeah.
That could very easily be 3 to 5 years.
Yeah.
And it's...
Is that because the cloud providers don't necessarily want to expose it, don't know what they should expose? It's going to take time for all of that to become cohesive.
I look at asset management as being the underlying problem here. That as we go and we distribute our infrastructure even beyond the borders of what we own as far as bare metal, it becomes harder and harder to keep track of what's out there.
And whose asset is that, right? When it's on layers of different providers of different things, right?
And whose responsibility is what?
Right.
Absolutely.
Like for a given Lambda function, like what is the telemetry you should be able to collect? And if something is affecting the underlying system, should you be able to get telemetry about that? Or it gets murky pretty quickly.
So to an extent, we're really waiting for the detection technology to give us all this information.
Mm-hmm. It is, yeah. I think it's the ability to sew that together is an important thing with any detection technology.
And if you think about it, one of the things that we're describing here, you mentioned EDR, and I think I did a little earlier as well, is that EDR is just really coming into its own as a best practice. And it has faced a number of challenges over the last, let's say, 6+ years in getting to this point.
Yeah.
And so, the struggles of how do I go and manage this additional technology is a challenge. And then how do I go into cloud infrastructure and start deploying this all across there as well? I think that it's a real challenge that people struggle with.
Yeah, I mean, it feels like, I've been discussing with someone previously about just the raw complexity of modern environments. And with every level of abstraction, and you had mentioned a little bit about this before, but I feel like with every level of abstraction, there's the ability to make a mistake or have a security assumption lost. And thus there should be some ability, I would say the counter for that for new techniques would be the ability to collect some level of telemetry there to then reassert your security or not, or reassert that you haven't, that things haven't changed, or that you do have in fact the visibility into what's happening. Because just the hand waving of like, well, the orchestrator's there now, it's handling it for you. I think it leaves a big opportunity for, compromise.
Well, let's go beyond compromise and talk about what the impact is. That's compromise without detection.
Right.
Right? I mean, you want to prevent everything that you can.
Right.
Absolutely. We can sit here and all agree on that.
Yeah.
But you can't always prevent things. Things happen.
Incidents will happen, yeah.
So then, the very least, you need to be able to detect it. And that's really the point of going and mapping these techniques, and even further, just making sure that you have the right telemetry or logs. Because I can't tell you how many times I've had conversations with incident response providers who say they show up in environments and there's no logging. And I'll tell you, it's about $400 an hour per head that they have there, waiting while everything's getting set up to start gathering the telemetry that you need in order to do the investigation. So,
not something you want to be doing after the fact.
It gets expensive.
Gotcha. Well, I think we maybe want to open it up to questions.
Yep, and just a reminder, if you have any questions, just type them into that Q&A box, and we have a couple right now. The first is about sharing the presentation. Yes, everyone on the webcast will be sent the presentation in full recording after, and it also will be available for on demand at capsulate.com. And the second is, what are the highest signal, most valuable attack techniques for Linux?
I'll let you take that one.
It's interesting. I think part of the where the framework has opportunity to grow is in helping highlight these. For the ones that are there now, and I'd have to circle back, but access to interactive command interfaces, I think is what they call it, which we sum up as like interactive shell access. I think that's a very meaningful one. And then I think some of the other techniques that they have that are high signal are modification of things like SSH keys, or obviously like Etsy password, or things like that, where you can see there's a direct one-to-one security benefit or security signal there. It doesn't require as much state correlation. And of course, anytime you can see an action that is either disabling a security mechanism or otherwise subverting the system. So loading of kernel modules, or disabling SE Linux, or whatever the case may be. Any of those, if you can see them as sort of the evasion techniques, are good. But I don't think those have been fleshed out enough in the framework. Like loading kernel modules are, but what there's this whole category of like defense evasion. I feel like there's so much that could be fleshed out. But I think those are the best signals when you can have them.
Great. If there are no other questions, that concludes our webcast for today. We hope everyone found it valuable. And if you have any additional questions, feel free to reach out to us at info@capsulate.com, and we will get back to you right away. Thank you, Josh, for joining us. Thank you, Brandon. We hope everyone has a good day.
Thank you, Lisa.